Good afternoon, everybody. I am Burcin Unel, and I'm the Energy Policy Director of the Institute for Policy Integrity. And I'm delighted to have you all here at the second panel of the day, Bracing for Impact, Climate Adaptation. So in the first panel, we talked about the risks that we are facing. And with this panel, we want to talk about what we can do to plan for these risks, knowing that they are actually happening here and now. So we have a very distinguished panel of policymakers who think about climate adaptation and policymaking at very different scales. So we have a city level, a state level, all the way to federal and national level. So I'm very excited to hear what they're going to say about this. So they're very accomplished panelists, and I'm not going to go through all their bios, but you can see the full bios in the booklets that you have. I'm going to briefly introduce them. First, we have Susanne DesRoches, who is the Deputy Director of Infrastructure and Energy at New York City Mayor's Office of Resiliency and Mayor's Office of Sustainability. She has been leading New York City's Climate Adaptation Task Force and overseeing the development of New York City Climate Resiliency Design Guidelines, and she's going to talk about New York City today. Then we have Pat Forbes, who is the Executive Director for Office of Community Development in Louisiana. And he oversees Louisiana's community development programs, including housing and economic development and infrastructure development programs that help speedy recovery from hurricanes like Katrina and Ike, as well as the floods of 2016. Then we have Craig Fugate, who is the Chief Emergency Management Officer at OneConcern, and he was the former FEMA administrator. During his tenure with FEMA, he led the agency through more than 500 presidentially declared major disasters and emergencies, and he's going to talk to us about emergency management at a national scale. And last but not least, we have Alice Hill, who is a Senior Fellow for Climate Change Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. She was a special assistant to President Obama, and she was a senior director for resilience policy on the National Security Council staff. And she led the development of national policy to build greater climate resilience. And she's going to talk about national and international scale risk management. So I'm very delighted to hear what they're going to say. First, a couple of housekeeping items. Our panelists are going to speak about 10-15 minutes, and then we're going to have a discussion and a Q&A session. We are going to take questions from the audience. You should all have index cards on your tables. So please write your questions and your name and affiliation if you choose to. And my colleague Isabel is here going to collect those cards and periodically bring them to me. All right. So with that, I'm going to leave the microphone to Susanne.
Thank you, Bertram, and thank you so much for having me today. Thank you. So I am going to, there's the panel, here we are. So I'm going to talk about adaptation at the local level. First, I'm going to go through just a little bit about how we see climate change will impact New York City, and then I'm going to talk about how the Mayor's Office of Resiliency really where we focus our efforts, what our mission is, and at the end, I will dive into one specific initiative. So during Hurricane Sandy, we had about 51 square miles flooded. It caused unprecedented damage and exposed really a broader vulnerability to coastal flooding. So we had almost 90,000 buildings inundated. There were tragically 44 lives lost. Almost $20 billion in damage, $19 billion in damages, as well as lost economic activity, which we know accompanies any of these large natural disasters. 2 million New Yorkers were without power, and some were without power for weeks, and thousands were displaced from their homes. So when we talk about the 520 miles of coastline, we're vulnerable in a number of different ways. So we're vulnerable to coastal storms, and by 2100, we think that vulnerability will affect almost a 1.2 million New Yorkers. So right now, that's about 3 times as many that are at risk today. And you can see on the map here, as you look at over time, those colors get lighter. Those are as we go in the out years. That's where the floodplain will exist. So sea level rise really will increase the size of that floodplain. So we see where we are today versus where we are in 2050, 2080, and 2100. And we're not just vulnerable to coastal events, we're also vulnerable to increased precipitation. And that can happen even in inland areas. So what do the climate projections look like for New York City? This gives us a kind of simplistic overview. We expect 50% increase in coastal storms by 2100, and that will really cause considerably more damage as we go out over time. By the 2050s, we could see up to 30 inches of sea level rise, and so this causes neighborhoods to be flooded during tidal events. It also causes the groundwater table to increase under the soil. For precipitation, we see about 1.5 times the intense precipitation events by the 2080s. So, we are seeing this, and you probably heard a little bit about this morning, but in the Northeast, these intense precipitation events are really on the rise. And then lastly, and a risk that folks don't talk quite as much about is heat. So today we have about 18 days on average per year that are over 90 degrees. When we look in the 2050s, we see that number tripling. So we go somewhere from 18 to 50 to 60 days over 90 degrees per year in New York City. And extreme heat is actually our deadliest natural hazard in New York City, and you can see the statistics here in the center. So it causes 13 heat stroke deaths a year, 450 heat-related emergency room visits, and 115 excess deaths. So this means a death that was caused by an underlying issue but was exacerbated by heat. We also know that dense urban environments are hotter than their surroundings. And you can see in the first bullet point, so we can be anywhere up to 22 degrees hotter than the surrounding areas outside of New York City. And then indoor spaces can be 20 degrees hotter than the spaces outdoor within the city. So these extreme heat, this extreme heat risk really impacts our most vulnerable New Yorkers. We know older adults and folks with mental health and health conditions really are impacted more by extreme heat. And also poverty and poor housing stock contribute to vulnerability to heat. So what is the New York City's response? So essentially we have the Mayor's Office of Resiliency, and we are charged with adapting to climate change. And that's by creating a more resilient city. And our mission is to use science-based analysis to develop policies, programs, and capacity building across New Yorkers in order to withstand climate change. So this mission is basically laid out across 4 main categories. The first is purely mitigating the risk, right? So what are the upgrades to physical conditions, the physical environment that we need to make in order to mitigate some of these risks? Our second main goal is to empower residents and businesses. So how can we engage with individuals, community groups, civic organizations, and the business community in order to help them prepare for climate change? We're also looking to build a climate-ready government, and this one I will focus on later in my next slides. And really, what do we need to do to enact policies and regulatory levers? What are some governmental reforms that need to take place in order to be able to plan and implement programs and mitigating the physical risks that will help improve our resiliency as a city? And then lastly, we want to continue to advance climate science. So the city has have worked with the New York City Panel on Climate Change since 2008. They are a scientific body made up of folks that are from the surrounding colleges, and they provide us with down-sampled climate projections for New York City and about a 100-mile radius around New York City. And these climate projections are really important for us to be able to make these policy decisions, and we continue to work with MPCC in the years to come. So the one that I'm going to focus on today is building a climate resilient government. We have the New York City Climate Resiliency Design Guidelines. So these guidelines have been in place for about 3 years. We're on to our third version. And what these climate design guidelines do is they take the climate science that comes to us in decadal form and in ranges of uncertainty, and it boils it down to what engineers and architects need to be able to plan and execute capital projects. So right now, this is being used by city capital agencies in their project planning and their project design. And it essentially complements an existing design structure and design process in order to be able to say, we're not going to use historical weather data, but we're going to use future-looking climate projections so that the things we build today will last for the full length of their useful life. So what does that really look like? So I'm going to give you an example of a project that is this doesn't have a pointer, but where the A box is and the B box is. The pink map on the right is the tidal floodplain in the 2050s. So this is where we anticipate that the city will have tidal flooding, so daily flooding, due to sea level rise. And the box on the right is the today and the future floodplain. So again, similar to the map I showed you earlier, the darker colors are today's floodplain, and as you move out in time, the lighter colors indicate the future floodplain. So project A is in a more vulnerable place. So if you are using the climate design guidelines and your project site is in location A, the guidelines instruct you to look for other sites, right? So we need to be signaling to city agencies that we don't want critical infrastructure being built in the tidal floodplain. We want them to look for alternative sites. And then project B gets built to a higher flood standard than is required by code. So this is an example of what the kind of granular level, and I'm going to go really deep on the local stage here. This is very granular data that we provide the design community in order to make these decisions. So I'm just going to focus on the box in red. So essentially, if you're reading the table from left to right, if I'm designing something that's useful life is going to last into the 2080s, then I'm designing it to today's floodplain plus 2 feet of freeboard, which is basically today's fudge factor, plus another 28 inches of sea level rise. So you can see how today the flood code requires you to use the floodplain plus 2 feet, plus we're adding sea level rise. And what that does is that it really signals to the design community, hey, this is how high you need to go to flood protect something that's going to last this long. So this is just one example of how the guidelines lay out this step-by-step process in order for capital agencies that work with the city to make their projects more resilient. So that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm super excited to be here to share a little bit of what the state of Louisiana is doing. There we go. And to hear a lot of the exciting things that are going on elsewhere. I would venture to say that, but for the fact that Louisiana is arguably the most disaster-prone state in the Union, you would probably not be hearing from a bureaucrat from Louisiana today. I use the word proudly. I have been trying to decriminalize it for years, and will continue to do so. Louisiana has been hit by some 6 hurricanes, 2 unnamed rain events, all of which resulted in at least federal declarations, if not catastrophic system failures since 2005, and consequently we have had a lot to deal with, and thankfully we have had quite a bit of money to try to deal with that. Some $17.5 billion. My agency alone has had responsibility for since Hurricane Katrina to drive recovery and ultimately what we came to know as driving resilience. It has been an evolutionary process for us. Starting with Katrina, we did a couple of things that frankly would have been unheard of in our state at the time had we not been whacked by Katrina and Rita within a month of each other. And that was insisting statewide on stricter building codes, and then in the recovery process, restricting who could get funding from us by virtue of their adoption of advisory-based flood elevations. This really would have been unheard of before Katrina or Rita, but that is in fact the effect of getting whacked, is that people's eyes are opened, and then in these cases so far, we get funding to try to do something about it. After Katrina and Rita, we move on to Gustav and Ike. Isaac again in 2012, which luckily for us occurred the same year as Sandy. Consequently, we were able to get some funds from that. The more important piece of that, though, is that it made us eligible for HUD's National Disaster Resilience Competition, which was $1 billion that President Obama's administration put out competitively for innovative approaches to adaptation and resilience. State of Louisiana got nearly $250 million from that competition. Not the least of which reason is because of all those other disasters, we have a sort of disaster infrastructure built up in Louisiana now. Again, whether fortunately or unfortunately. And so the result of that is a couple of projects that we are doing in the interest of resilience. First thing that I will mention is our LA Safe program. And that is essentially a framework for adaptation based on risk. After Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, the state completely revamped their approach to coastal land loss and coastal storm surge threat by pulling all those pieces together into one agency, and also by focusing on it, by dedicating funds to it, and which was a thing that we frankly had never done before. CPRA is science, data, engineering driven decision making, which was not a thing that we had relative to coastal resilience at the time. So when we move on then to these resilience grants that we received, LA Safe is essentially takes the data, the risk data from the CPRA that we have that looks 50 years into the future, and says, okay, what does the risk look like for these communities? And we look at base flood elevations 50 years from now, and we sort of categorize in three different groups. One is basically untenable going into the future. The other is at risk. Then the other is much lower risk. And one thing that is not unique, but maybe unusual about Louisiana is that we have the largest port system in the nation, the second largest fishery in the nation, and nearly a third of the country's oil and gas is either produced or flows through the state. So we have to live and work in the coast, even though that's very dangerous, quite obviously. So that's why adaptation is so critical for us. So LA Safe is essentially looks at these three different risk pools and says, okay, how are we going to react and respond through each of those? We spent, I think, $4 million going around the state, around the coastal region, engaging with actual individuals, not government leaders necessarily, unless they wanted to come to the meeting, but with individuals to start to figure out what folks' priorities were for their future once they had a clear understanding of what the risk was where they lived. And as crazy as it may sound, this was really the first time they were getting that information firsthand. The result is projects in the untenable area, which I'm going to show you a video of here a picture of in a second, and then projects for adaptation in that sort of medium risk zone, as well as a thing that we had not thought of before, which is projects for adaptation in receiving areas. When people retreat from the coast, they have to go somewhere. And after Katrina and Rita, what we learned was that we had absolutely no preparedness for the influx of people who were moving to higher ground. And so the third piece of it is actually preparing the landing areas for people who are moving from the coast. In the untenable category is a place called Ile de Jean Charles. It is a Native American community that has been there for 150 years. Its population at one time was 400 people. That's down to probably less than 50 now. But what HUD gave us a grant to do is to move this community en masse to a new place for them to live. This is a picture of Ile de Jean Charles in 1963. And then you can see the progression from 71 to 98 to today. And if you see the dark area around Ile de Jean Charles, that's all water. If you look at the 71 picture, and I'll go back actually this one, because I'm speaking with folks who grew up on the island, they used to walk from the island over to the neighboring community across the marsh. And as you can see now, it is all water. Louisiana suffers not only from global sea level rise, but also from subsidence, because we've levied the Mississippi River off. All the sediment dumps off the continental shelf, and we don't build land with it anymore. So our land is continuing to sink, which is a huge contributor, which is why we're sort of, unluckily, on the front end of this process of experiencing the effects of sea level rise.
And nutria.
And nutria, yes. Thank you. This is the island today. But Ile de Jean Charles is not unique. This is where the folks that I've talked to used to walk across to that green area across the way there. Ile de Jean Charles is not unique, though. Since 2000, this is a population change from 2000 to 2010. People are organically self-migrating from the coast already. We know that for a fact, and it will continue. The issue that we have and the challenge is now how do we make sure that we do that in a way that is organized and not chaotic. The folks on Ile de Jean Charles have been referred to regrettably as the first climate change refugees. We never refer to them as refugees. They are brave pioneers who are doing something that nobody's done before, and that's moved their whole community to a new place and try to make that community work. So, but we have to look at how do we do that with these other communities that face, not only in Louisiana, but around the country and around the world, who face these same challenges. I'm sorry, how's my time going?
You have about a couple of minutes.
Okay, thank you. I want to step forward to one last piece, which is sort of this evolutionary aspect of where we've been and where we're going. Katrina and Rita, we sort of adopted some stricter regulations. With these Isaac grants, we really jumped out front and started looking at resilience and adaptation and how do we do that right. And then in 2016, we were hit with 2 catastrophic rainstorms, which, of course, what we've been preparing for is storm surge since 2005, and then we get hit with these rainstorms. Well, that's another eye-opening event for us. Also another funding opportunity, because we're getting some $1.2 billion just for activities that mitigate future risk, not for recovery, but for future risk mitigation. And what our governor decided to do was, instead of distributing those funds among the impacted areas, was to completely change the way the state addresses riverine flooding. And that is to move to a watershed-based approach to flood risk management, which is anathema to local governments for the most part. They have their tax base, they spend tax dollars to protect their taxpayers, and it does not result in optimal investment or safety building, I can tell you. And so we are investing $1.2 billion in changing the paradigm in Louisiana and the way that we address flood risk. We know that that's not a tenth enough money to solve all the flood risk problems in the state, but we hope that it is enough money to entice people to change the way the state addresses the risk, so that going forward, in the earlier panel, you heard lots of instances of investments. The state is investing billions of dollars a year. Private individuals are investing billions and billions of dollars a year to drive those investments in a way that follows this resilience policy and hopefully makes us all safer in the future.
Thank you.
Good, I got to climb. Good afternoon, everybody. No PowerPoints. It's after lunch. So I was asked to talk about this from the national perspective and policy and my ideas. So I think, first of all, as an emergency manager, it's important to note that our conversation has changed from just talking about climate change, talking about how do we adapt. Because I think too often we've been portraying global warming. Climate change is a nice word, everybody likes it, but we're talking about global warming. It's heating up. We're causing it. There's no debate. And as it's heating up, the changes are occurring now, not in the future. And our current policies, infrastructures, and way of living is not adapting fast enough. When I got to FEMA in 2009, I thought our primary charge was not to repeat another response like we had in Katrina. So we kept focusing on building a better response system. However, the disasters kept getting bigger. And it was a point of diminishing returns. In 2012, a day or two after Sandy hit, we were about to go up to New Jersey, where the infamous hug didn't really occur, but there was a lot of proximity there, I saw. The president said to me, Craig, the discussion about climate change is over. We got to start talking about adaptation. Well, how do you adapt to something you can't measure yet? Impacts are not known. Looking backwards, and I was in the Rolling Stones this last week, for an emergency manager. I wasn't on the cover, but I was in the Rolling Stones. I described dealing with climate adaptation like driving down a road you've never been on 100 miles an hour, looking in the rearview mirror. Nothing good will come of that. And I think we've made this so hard that people aren't even willing to look at the first step. So I'm going to kind of lay out some what I call bare-knuckle ideas. That this is not something in our future, our children's future, this is now. There are things we can do immediately, things we can do in the short term and then long term. And I want to talk about this from the policy perspective. The first one is defining flood risk by flood insurance rate maps is doing a great disservice to our citizens who believe they do not have a flood risk. Do you guys know what FEMA pays for? And it's not FEMA's money, it's your dollars. Do you know what you pay for in disasters? Uninsured losses. If there's insurance, your tax dollars do not get used in disasters. To give you some idea of the magnitude of the uninsured losses in Sandy, it was over $1 billion went out in about 32 days for individual assistance to people who didn't have flood insurance. In the Great Flood of Louisiana, 2016, we did $1 billion in about 30 days with a much smaller population base. Why? People were protected by levees. Therefore, they were not in the 1% flood risk, and therefore did not require insurance for a federally backed mortgage. But that's meaningless when you dump feet of water behind the levees, which now act as dams. And many of these families were veterans now of 2 catastrophic events. They'd actually relocated from Louisiana, Katrina impacted regions to the Baton Rouge region, started over again, and flooded out. And because they weren't in that 1% insurance requirement for flood insurance, they didn't think they were in a flood zone. Like, what do you think the levees were there for? But we communicate flood risk entirely wrong. We talk about the percentage of a 100-year event. Even in Houston, the Weather Service says that's probably about every 40 years. Well, I'm kind of thinking that's like every 4 months. But it's this idea that the first thing we can do right now is financial resiliency. More people understanding flood risk is not defined by flood insurance rate maps. That just sets how much it costs. If you're outside of that flood zone, it's much more affordable. And trust me, the National Flood Insurance Program is one of the, as you've heard earlier in the presentation, trying to reform that program. It needs a lot of work. It's imperfect, but it's what we got right now. And the more that we can get people to take on insurance means that they'll be more financially resilient from these extreme events, because they're not all tropical. Colorado Front Range 2013 was not a tropical event. We've seen increasingly extreme rainfall events across the country. There's no state immune from this. And far too many people don't understand their homeowner's policy doesn't protect them from flood insurance. So if you want to talk about something we can do right now to start building financial resilience from extreme rainfall events, which is one of the strongest signals we're seeing in climate right now, is increasing the amount of flood insurance uptake by people who traditionally have not bought it. And it's not all just the federal government. Increasingly, the private sector is entering back into the flood insurance market. Now, people may not like insurance. They may say, well, you know, we have a responsibility to deal with this some other way. None of that's going to change tomorrow. But in 30 days, if you had flood insurance today, you're protected against the next flood event. It may not seem like the greatest thing you can do about climate adaptation, but it's real and it's right now. Second thing, I do a lot of work with the Pew Trust on their flood ready or flood prepared communities, is we have got to fix how we're insuring risk to take away the subsidy to quit building stuff where it shouldn't be built. We have a large population that is not going to get fixed overnight, and we need to maintain a viable flood insurance program and disaster policies to ensure that we don't leave people behind. But we have got to move away from federal policy encouraging growth in high-risk areas without changing behavior. And my solution is to quit writing flood insurance on new construction. If the private sector will insure it, have a nice day. But why should taxpayers be underwriting risk, which is not about affordable housing, folks? I haven't seen affordable housing built in Florida on the coast in my lifetime. You're subsidizing high-rises, affluence, and providing a subsidy that is not sustainable as taxpayers. But we also need to now start changing federal policy. We saw the first steps, which is actually kind of amazing, given it's a Republican-led Senate. They don't use the words climate change a lot, but they love the word resiliency. And in the Senate Transportation Bill, talking about resiliency and building the future risk and setting aside money so that as we make investments in transportation infrastructure, we're not just building it back to past data. Because I think it's a growing understanding that the past data is not telling us what the risks are. Congress has also been increasing mitigation dollars before disasters through some work they did on the Stafford Act after the last round of hurricanes to increase the amount of money going out before. The Pew's also supporting, similar to the EPA's program for water systems, revolving loan programs to provide more capital to state and local government to build back infrastructure and make improvements. But we also know that policy from the federal level isn't what's going to drive this. It's going to be policy at the state and local level. We've seen one of the reddest states in the nation take on flood risk head on, and that's the state of Texas. Because it wasn't just Harvey. It was reoccurring flooding in many parts of Texas that was driving change in a legislature that's only willing to meet every 2 years. To actually take money out of their rainy day fund and begin investing it in mitigation in those areas where there weren't going to be federal dollars. So we're seeing that this is not something we don't have to wait for new data. We can start now by shifting the conversation away from building back the way we've always done, only funding what is required and not incorporating future risk, and start building infrastructure in communities that are more resilient. But long term, the bigger challenge I still think is doing what we've always been doing and trying to adapt it to this event may not be enough. I don't really see myself as a climate alarmist, but I don't think that just incremental changes are going to get us where we need to be. And this is going to require some bold thinking, and that's not generally where Washington has excelled. I think the bold thinking is coming from governors like John Bel Edwards, who said something that I don't think any Louisiana governor had ever said before, is there may be places in Louisiana we're not going to be able to rebuild. Because every politician likes to say after disaster, we're going to rebuild it back better. We're going to rise from the ashes. And John Bel Edwards was brave enough to say, you know, there's places in Louisiana that we're just not going to be able to do that anymore. And we shouldn't give people false hope. And we should make a plan about what that transaction looks like and how we're going to change. We're seeing California on the wildland fires. Again, we're not going to get everybody out of the interface overnight, but we can change the construction materials, the roof coverings. We can start doing more to look at how we manage vegetation, control burns, and other things that may not always be popular, but become effective tools in managing the risk in the wildland-urban interface. Who else with firefighters would come up with an acronym that says WUI? But the WUI is not just a West Coast threat. If you actually look at the U.S. Forest Service, the WUI is actually bigger on the East Coast. You have more interface here that's only waiting for the next drought to have significant impacts. And so as we look at what's happening, we're seeing states change. My state of Florida, it's known as a purple state for presidential elections, but the legislature, cabinet, and the governor's office is about as red as they come. In the previous administration of Governor Scott, no official was allowed to say climate change out loud. There's actually fun videos on YouTube of various state officials saying everything but climate change. Governor DeSantis hasn't been out exactly saying climate change, but he's also appointed a chief science officer who is a known person that deals with climate and climate adaptability from one of the major universities. He's appointed a chief resilience officer, and he's made it clear that the state of Florida will deal with facts, as inconvenient as they may be. So in a state that had gone literally in one election cycle from you can't say climate change, but doing everything they can now about climate adaptation without actually going out and saying climate change, these are like seismic shifts at the state level in my home state. I mean, we're going from ignore it, it will go away, to we got to do something about it, even if we're not always sure what that is. And ultimately, this will come down to a test of the resiliency, not of buildings, but of people. And it's going to be how willing and how quickly will our communities be able to change and adapt. And I want to leave one last thought with you, because I figure questions will be more fun than me talking. We have to be careful that resiliency only happens for the affluent. The underrepresented communities, the low income, the poor, they're usually not at the table when decisions are made. Their voice is not always heard. We have to remember we're not building resiliency in buildings. We have to build resiliency in communities. And that means the whole community. What they're talking about in California, where people are being displaced further and further away from their jobs, we've lived it in Florida. When Hurricane Wilma destroyed a lot of the affordable housing in Palm Beach County, a disproportionate number of those structures were red tagged for demolition, were bought up by developers and turned into high rises for the affluent, the working class. And this isn't even about low income, poor housing. This is just working folks. And I think this is the thing we got to understand. We're creating such divides in our communities that it's showing up in just land use and housing availability. People in West Palm no longer live there. They can't afford it. They're living on the other side of I-75. They're migrating west. So they're further and further away from their jobs. That's increasing the carbon footprint as they try to go to work. And it's, again, we have created resiliency for the affluent. The newer construction is better construction. It's more resilient to the storms. The people that got displaced wasn't so much new construction, what was available. And we've actually put them further away from their work, their schools, their neighborhoods. And their neighborhoods are going away. So this last thought, as we talk about all of this, from adaptation to building resiliency, it has to be for the communities that are there, not for what fits our plan. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm really delighted to have a chance to speak with you. I am going to ask you a question right off the bat because I'm curious. How many of you, please raise your hand if you have had any formal education in climate change? All right, that's higher. That's great. That's about 50%. I'd say maybe even more. Most of the audiences and most of the policymakers that I have worked with have had no education in climate change. And one of the things that I have seen as a result of that is a discounting of the risk. Now, we're all naturally optimistic. That's why we still keep getting married in the face of the statistics. That's a very good thing. It helps us get through life. But when it comes to climate change, our optimism may get in the way, as well as our bias to discount anything that we have never seen before. And with climate change, if you haven't realized it here today yet, we are facing an existential threat. It will upend public health, our markets, our security, our built environment, pretty much everything that we have built our lives around for thousands of years. It will happen in a very speedy way, in a quick period of time, because we simply have not been able to understand yet that the underlying assumptions that we all use every day no longer hold true. We can't build a building to historical risk. We've heard a lot about building practices here, guidelines. We have a complex system of building codes in the United States. It's based on model codes. Some other countries follow that as well. We do not yet have a model building code that accounts for future climate risk. So to the extent communities are choosing to rely on even the latest model building codes, they aren't building for the future risk that we know will occur during the life of the building. Our markets aren't responding. We heard about the TCFD, the disclosure requirements. A recent survey of 1,126 companies who have been following TCFD, only 4% are doing climate disclosures in accordance with what that task force recommended. And of course, many companies are not yet following. We heard about Ile-de-Gens, and that was an effort by the HUD department, by HUD, under the Obama administration. That was $48 million for approximately 40 families to move. If you multiply that across the United States, what are we looking at? We have coastal villages in Alaska that are slipping into the ocean at the rate of 60 feet a year, eroding them. The estimates to move each of those villages is somewhere between about $1 million per villager. The costs involved, we're just not engaging yet on what is ahead. We've had plenty of people trying to tell us what's ahead. One of the CEOs of our major reinsurance company has been blunt. He said at 4 degrees, and by the way, that seems to be what we may be headed for unless we can get further cooperation worldwide, the world is uninsurable. And if that means the world is uninsurable, that means that it falls on governments and our Government Accountability Office, the watchdog for the U.S. government since 2013, has been trying to capture the attention of Congress and the American people by placing climate change on the high-risk list, meaning it is a high risk to the federal treasury. If it's a high risk to the world's most powerful economy, we all should be concerned. So, understanding that the nature of the challenge is great, there are some things that we all need to look at both nationally and internationally. Two important ones have been touched on here, and that's land use is first among them. We have, despite the wake-up call of Sandy, and I would say that for the federal government it was an enormous wake-up call as to the risks involved, we are still seeing more coastal development in areas that are at higher risk than those that are lower risk in our coastal states. We still are making those investments in property that will, at some point, somebody will have to pay for. Similarly, we have 1/3 of our homes now in the United States at risk of wildfire. You may recall you heard about the devastating fires that we had in California right after the Paradise Canyon fire. LA County, I've lived in LA County for many years. The county supervisors approved a development in Tejon Pass. Anyone who knows LA, it's outside of LA. They said we have huge affordable housing challenges here. So they approved a development for 19,000 homes that the mapping, without considering future risk from climate change, but just historical risk, said that it was either at extreme or very extreme fire risk. Similarly, San Diego County just recently approved a 1,000 home development in an area that has burned every 7 years, has burned 7 times since 1950. And one thing we know, if it's burned before, in all likelihood, it may burn again. So with those challenges, I thought that Craig did an excellent job of laying out some of the choices we have. In flood, we are a little bit more attuned than we are yet in wildfire as to what the choices are ahead, perhaps because we went down one path with flood. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. In the 1960s, we decided to do the National Flood Insurance Program, and that has been very difficult for us to extricate ourselves from and to get to charging actuarially sound pricing. So one thing that I'm concerned about with wildfire is these properties become uninsurable, which they will. What will our policy response be there? I hope it's more about land use and less about communities asking the federal government to insure risky behavior, which is what is occurring now. So I think that one thing that was spoken about in our first panel is disclosure. We need to make it mandatory to disclose financial risk. Our markets are not yet responding. In England, which has led this effort under Mark Carney, they are now requiring scenario testing, and we need to do the same to drive true sharing of information. What you'll hear from some is we don't want to be the first mover here. It will hurt us. We would rather just wait for somebody else to take the leap and disclose their risk. So we need to encourage others to disclose. Because we're at a law school and because I'm a reformed lawyer, a former judge, I think that our legal system has not really responded in the powerful way that it can. We need to examine our liability laws. Why is it that a developer can knowingly put homes in harm's way, sell them, and there's no liability attached? Why is it that we don't have requirements for our professionals, our engineers, our designers, our architects, and we're not seeking greater liability for their failure to advise clients as to their risks? And our corporate boards, we are seeing more movement here Exxon shareholders sued Exxon for failing to account for climate risk. Australia has warned its officers and directors that they face a liability for failing to account for climate risk. And certainly the Delaware Supreme Court, in an unrelated climate case, has signaled that officers and directors could be personally liable for failing to consider a significant risk to the company. I'm a former white-collar crime prosecutor. I can tell you, you get the attention of professionals when a professional goes to prison for failure to do their job. And at some point, putting people in harm's way could be criminally negligent. We've seen that in Florida after the terrible events where elderly patients died in a nursing home because they lacked adequate backup power. Some of them had temperatures as high as 109 degrees. Florida chose to pursue that criminally. So I think there's a lot here to work towards. We can also make it a blanket policy of any government taxpayer dollars. Not a single cent more is spent on non-resilient choices. We shouldn't be subsidizing development in any way, shape, or form in areas that are risky. And finally, we need to do a much better job of sharing best practices. One of the challenges with adaptation, as we've heard, it's community-based, it's all local choices, it's very dependent on individual risks. So what right now happens is we leave communities up to making their own choices, and we've seen examples of terrific communities here who are taking the lead. You've heard from New York, California, Louisiana, who are taking their risks very seriously. But I'll never forget the mayor of a small town in Alabama, aptly named Perdido Beach. She was facing sea level rise, coastal erosion. She said, "I'm a part-time mayor in a small town. I know I have risks. What do I need to do?" There's no one available to help out our many small communities right now. And we need to do a much better job of helping them understand their risks, providing them the tools, resources, money to make better choices. And that, by the way, is not only in the United States, it's also across the globe. And one of the remarkable things, and I'll leave you with this, is that adaptation is actually occurring in many other places, far less affluent, with far less data, and far less of a skill set than we have here in the United States. But they are moving forward, and unfortunately, we are lagging. We have the economic wherewithal to withstand that for a while, but it's time we all get busy. So I'm really delighted to have a chance to have been here with you today, and I'm super delighted to see this room so full of people who want to do more. There is no lack of things to do because we are behind. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. This was great. Again, a reminder: you have index cards on your tables, and I'm going to start the discussion session. First, I want to pick up on some of the threads that all of you mentioned. You know, we know that this is happening. We know that this is happening now. We know that climate change is very costly. At the same time, adaptation is costly, and we have to think about policies, and we have to do analysis, and we have to come up with a plan. And all of you talked about how we need to look at future risks. We can't be looking at the rearview mirror. We have to look at forward-looking analysis. We have to look at forward data, and there are risks and uncertainties involved with that. So I want to ask you about that. I mean, for example, New York has a plan, and with Superstorm Sandy, we would have been, maybe better off if like the surge was not 12 feet, but it stayed under 10 feet, so the subway didn't flood. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and there's a lot of trade-offs associated with picking policies and regulations. And my question is, one, like, how do we deal with these uncertainties, especially given that we have a lot of policy trade-offs? And, two, like, this is an overwhelming task, and, where do we begin and where do we focus? How do you balance all these different aspects? I think
Is this on? This is on?
Yes.
Since mine's working, I'll talk first. Yeah, so in Louisiana, one piece of the response has been data science, engineering to try to predict what that future looks like. But I think the second piece of the answer is that we can't plan the way that we have in the past, like Mr. Fugate referred to earlier, is this sort of 100-year floodplain line that everybody imagines they're safe on one side of it and not safe on the other side. As good a predictive tools as we might have, it still wouldn't make sense for us to rely on those predictive tools. I think that's sort of, for us at least, the definition of adaptability is to continue to roll things in the right direction at every turn, because we can't know exactly what it's going to look like and what that risk might be, and consequently, we need to be able to adapt to whatever occurs.
So I'll just speak to the design guidelines. So in the design guidelines, which are multi-hazard, we look at the 90th, the top percentile of heat, partially because we know, as I presented, that heat causes a number of deaths per year in New York City. We looked at the 90th percentile in precipitation, and what that looks like from a climate projection perspective is that it's more intense rainfalls more frequently. And then for sea level rise, and this is where I think where policy decision making it needs to be iterative. We're looking at using the 50th percentile sea level rise, with the exception of large-scale infrastructure projects, which would need to go through more of a scenario planning. So the idea of the guidelines is that it affects any scale project, new construction or substantial renovation, any scale project, but that for larger scale projects, we are looking at the range of uncertainty. So if you were building something out to 2100, you're looking at that full range of up to 72 inches of sea level rise, and how could that piece of infrastructure be made to withstand something on that order of magnitude.
So I think that with uncertainty, that has been something that we've all pointed to for the lack of action. But we can plan for uncertainty, and unfortunately we have fewer projects that have done this, but there's a great example in Los Angeles. There's a train corridor that runs, beautiful train ride, runs right along the coast between Los Angeles and San Diego. And they needed to replace a bridge. So they simply replaced the bridge in a way that over time, if the sea level rise projections were wrong, they could easily and cheaply raise the bridge rather than waiting for a very expensive full retrofit if it turns out that it's simply too expensive. What we do know is that building in resilience now saves a lot of money in the long run. At FEMA, under Craig's leadership, along with the National Institute of Building Sciences, they've done a number of studies that say for every dollar invested now in resilience, we save somewhere between $4 and $6 in other additional costs. The Global Adaptation on Commission just came out with their report citing international study that for every $1 billion in a developing nation that we invest now in resilience, we'll save somewhere between $4 and $36 billion in terms of recovery and help to them. So we need to get over just sitting back and waiting for the bad thing to happen, and we need to figure out how we can invest now in reducing some of these impacts. We will never reduce all of the damage. Would be too expensive for us to achieve.
Yeah, and the other problem I see is we're paralyzed waiting for the right answer, and we don't have time. So I'll give you an example of a city that did something that we found out after the fact. And they're not really sure why or how, and this will be a good history project, but the city of Nashville, for some reason, made the decision back in the 70s and early 80s that building 1 foot above base flood elevation in a 100-year flood zone wasn't probably enough. So they put 2 feet in there. It gets fought periodically, it gets some noise, but nobody really fights it anymore. In 2010, they had catastrophic flooding in Nashville. Just that one step they calculated avoided you paying out as taxpayers' losses of over $1 billion. Unfortunately, it was only in the 100-year flood zone. But just that showed how taking steps now, if we're waiting for the answer, we're never getting there. But just think about doubling, or in the case of the city of New Orleans, they've tripled. They built 3 feet above base flood elevation for new construction in the flood zones. But that flood zone is much bigger than it used to be. So just think if we just started moving towards adding, and again, everybody gets all uptight about affordable housing. It's about this much, folks. How much could that cost me? That's a couple more truckloads of fill. And you could avoid $1 billion in losses like Nashville did in 2010. This is the whole idea behind the federal floodplain management standard. We didn't have the answers. We said just double the height at which we're making investments for federal construction above the minimum of 1 foot and triple it for critical infrastructure. Do you know that state and local governments can do that already? And that if you have ordinances that say you build 2 feet above or 3 feet above, or that your flood zone is now 500 years, all federal investment must meet local building codes? You don't have to wait to Washington to solve this. As Nashville pointed out, doing something that somebody thought was a good idea actually made them more resilient from the 2010 floods to the tune of about $1 billion of avoidance of losses.
Thank you. So another common thread that I heard you all mention, and some of the questions are coming in, is when we talk about adaptation, how do we think about inequality? Because we know that climate change is disproportionately affecting low-income and minority communities, communities of color. They are already bearing a huge burden, and as we think about adaptation policies, how can we make sure that these policies are just and inclusive, and we do it in a way that we do not further burden these communities?
Yeah, I'll jump in. And that last slide that I had up that showed the migration away from the coast, you can take a guess at what the median income of the folks who moved was. It's higher than the median income was of those communities before they left, because they were the people who could afford to move. At Ile-de-Jean-Charles, it's the same thing. The folks who are left there are the only ones, the only reason they're still there, for the most part. They love living on the island, despite all the flooding. But for the most part, they are people who could not afford to move themselves in the past. So what that means is we have to figure out the finances of that, and it is a stunning picture when you think about how much money we're spending to move communities. But it's absolutely going to be necessary, because folks who can't afford it are the ones who are being left behind. We've also found since Katrina, lower income people predominantly live in the more flood prone areas. It's just, it may seem intuitive now. It was not intuitive to us at the time, but it became quite clear when we started seeing where our money was going and who we were helping and how much it cost, that the folks in the flood in the lower areas were predominantly low and moderate income. So it's a critical question. Unfortunately, that's just restating your question. It's not giving you an answer. We are looking at the ways that we can make sure we adapt to that reality now.
So there is no question that these disasters hit the poor, the disabled, harder than it hits those who have more means to evacuate, relocate, make other decisions. I think this is an area where, again, we could learn from other nations' practices. We have in Mexico, they did a disaster insurance program that provides much more quickly disaster aid to their population to help them withstand these efforts. In Uganda, they have a forecast-based insurance. So if it's a really bad event forecasted, they distribute funds to help people get ready for the event. We need to start thinking more creatively about how we approach this, but there will have to be very deep focus on making sure that those less fortunate can continue to thrive in the face of this. One thing I hadn't realized is how hard our elevation policies, and that is probably the best solution for people who are located in flood-prone areas. But imagine for the disabled how difficult that is and how that undermines their community. That was some great work that FEMA did to show if you're elevating a home by 10 feet and there's no elevator in it, that means that those who are less mobile are really further isolated, and we know that social isolation kills. So we have to think through what can we do to help alleviate that crisis point.
So I want to highlight, I know we've been talking a lot about sort of coastal disasters, flooding, but in New York City, we are very focused on excessive and extreme heat. We have something called the Cool Neighborhoods program. And so, taking into consideration that you can actually develop programs and policies that target vulnerable communities, including low-income communities, we're spending about $100 million to alleviate heat in areas where we have a higher level on our heat vulnerability index. So we created an index. It's done by community district, and it has a number of different factors that go into it. What is the built environment? What is the socioeconomic makeup of the neighborhood, access to healthcare, et cetera? And we can see that certain parts of the city have a higher are higher on the heat vulnerability index, and therefore their populations are more vulnerable to heat. So we developed the Cool Neighborhoods program. It's $100 million worth of spending on targeted tree planting, cool roofs. We developed a Be a Buddy program where folks are checking on vulnerable New Yorkers. So you can actually build and develop through using available data at the local level programs that can really address certain types of risks and vulnerabilities directly to those communities.
Yeah, I think the federal government has a tested system of dealing with inequality, and that's means testing assistance. And again, driving the resources to where the greatest need is through means testing, that once you reach certain income levels, you may no longer be eligible for the federal grants or federal programs. That being said, there's another part of this that I'm very concerned about, and that is well-meaning advocates who are screaming bloody murder about elevation, relocation, and stronger building codes, saying we're making homes less affordable. Well, I'm going to be blunt with you. Why should poor people live in crap when you don't have to? Because that's what you're doing when you're saying we're going to build homes that are not survivable because they're cheap in the name of affordable housing. I want to ask, who's making money off of that? Because this ain't being done for free. So as long as builders can build lower standard homes quicker and faster and profit from that, it's going to continue. But this argument that we're pitting homeless advocates and affordable housing advocates against stronger building codes and building requirements and land use to prevent future disasters is idiotic. We have to join together. We should not put people who can't afford better and less safe housing because it's cheaper. It just grows the risk.
That actually really ties well with the next question that I was about to ask. How are each of your government agencies working to prevent these risky investments by the real estate industry? Exactly what you mentioned.
Keep going first.
Yeah, let's put it this way. Some of the biggest opponents to a lot of things like building codes, land use, and other things we know we're going to have to use to adapt to this are people who are in the transactional business. They don't have the property long enough to incur the risk of what climate looks like. So and again, I'm not saying these are bad people, I'm just saying the economy of building houses, let's just stick with something simple, is transactional. A home builder only has that for a certain amount of time and then they sell it, they made their money. The financial institutions make more money when you close on a house than the interest you're going to pay back long term. Why do you think they want you to keep refinancing your house? They make money on transactions. Guess who else makes money on transactions? Every state and local government who taxes those transactions and generates revenue. All of these transactional activities don't have to deal with long-term risk. So the incentive when you start talking about elevation requirements, increasing the requirements for building, it affects their business model because it's costing them money. So they're naturally opposed to this. But why are they opposed to this and how are they able to continue it? It's because they still get access to capital. Until capital starts pricing this risk differently, I don't know how we change this. There is something else that's happened. It's not been mentioned yet. Moody's sent out an advisory letter several years ago talking about if communities are not taking steps to adapt to climate risk, it could affect their ability to service their long-term bonds. Moody bought up a company in the Valley whose business is figuring out how to price exposure to climate change. When we start affecting local, municipal, and state bond ratings, we're going to get their attention very quickly. But we have to understand, as long as we're dealing with transactional economies, and the bottom line is insurance and capital is providing the mechanisms to allow that to occur, what is in their financial model that says they need to do anything differently? These are not bad people. It's just the financial business transactions that are set up that don't fall within the scope of the climate impacts of the disasters. And it goes back to the financing of this, the insurance of this, and then the fact that we run a socialist program for disaster response. We ought to quit calling them disaster programs. They're disaster bailouts for local and state development in high-risk areas. And as you heard, South Carolina is building more extreme exposures because of the flood insurance program and the disaster program. They couldn't do that if the state legislature had to fund that exposure. Just think about it. If we got rid of FEMA, got rid of the federal flood insurance program, would our coastal communities that have been hit by hurricanes look the same if the states had to pay all that? Or would they have changed what they were doing?
Great. So just a couple of things I wanted to highlight. In New York City, there are a number of different ways to make the built environment stronger. One is the building code, and our building code is higher than it's the 2 feet of freeboard. And then what I discussed earlier is with the release of the guidelines, what we're saying to the industry, and I think this goes back to what was said earlier, is what is the professional responsibility to advise clients on the level of risk, right? So what is the engineering community's responsibility and eventually potentially legal responsibility or liability to say this is a published document by the City of New York. It shows that you need to be using forward-looking climate data in the city's facilities, and how does that impact how private sector players are looking at their development. So that's sort of one avenue that we see. We're pushing the industry in general to say it's no longer okay for you to use historical weather data. You have to be looking at the climate projections, and we've made it very clear what we're expecting you to use in the built environment, at least for New York City facilities. The other tool that we have is zoning, and I think there have been zoning changes in New York City post-Sandy. We have something called special flood hazard districts that limit density, and I think that that's also a first step towards how do we inform communities and work with communities to understand their own risk. and working with those neighborhoods. There's no silver bullet that is going to work across every neighborhood. They are all have different characteristics. Some of them have very different risks, and that community engagement piece is another part of how do we develop a community-based strategy that will mitigate their risk.
We have a couple of different projects. Ile-de-Jean-Charles is one. Another one is called Pecan Acres, where we're moving the folks to an entirely new community together. And what we're doing to address that, what we are learning through this is that it's great. It seems like this great giveaway to give somebody a house that's worth $150,000, but when they've been living in a $40,000 house or an almost worthless house because of the cost of insurance and the repetitiveness of flooding, they haven't had to pay taxes before, and now they have to pay taxes. They don't have insurance, and now they have to have insurance. And so we've had to come up with ways to build resilience into the communities, one through efficient design, elevated design well above the flood base flood elevation, 2-4 feet or more, always elevated regardless of where it sits in the floodplain, super energy efficient, and we're building in economic development projects into the community that can generate revenue to help offset their increased cost of living. Because if we don't do that, it's a failure ultimately. And so, yeah.
From the federal government's perspective, the Obama administration was the first administration to actively look at what climate change adaptation would look like. It was part of the President's Climate Action Plan issued in 2013. Some valiant efforts, but I don't think we could declare victory on that. I will say that the Trump administration has been absent from climate adaptation. FEMA does not mention climate change in its new strategic plan. It really has not been messaging about climate. But there are bright spots as to what the federal government is doing. Particularly, it seems to be pushed by Congress. There's the National Disaster Recovery Act, which requires that 6% of what we spend on disasters will go to hazard mitigation. It's challenging in hazard mitigation not to talk about the increasing risk from climate change, so I hope that FEMA, as it works with other agencies to spend this money, does talk about the fact that sea level rise, which is climate driven, will affect the risk. We're also seeing that Congress, through the National Defense Reauthorization Act, is driving greater preparedness on our military bases. They have required the Department of Defense to talk about what the risks are to those bases. And the Department of Defense on its own actually took the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard, which President Trump revoked, ironically, 10 days before 4 feet of rain fell on Houston. But the Department of Defense has now adopted that standard essentially for all of its facilities. So there is some movement, but certainly we are not seeing active engagement under this administration on climate adaptation.
Okay, I'm going to switch to a different topic. So we've been talking about public policy for adaptation, public projects, what the government can do. But what about individuals, and are individuals adapting, and how do you see policymakers' roles in individuals informing or being informed or promoting good adaptation behavior? I mean, when I was living in Florida, I often joked about moving to Jupiter. So after Brian's presentation, I'm going to maybe rethink. But what do you see as the role of policymakers in, for example, preventing from people moving to flood zones for, or beaches for their retirement?
Well, this is one of the areas, again, the Pew's been focused on. Do you know that in a lot of places in the United States, there's no requirement to disclose prior flood history when you go to buy a home? Wouldn't you think if you're going into one of most people's biggest single investment, there should be a truth act that you have to disclose prior flood impacts. I mean, what's happening is a lot of these homes, they're not in the mandatory flood purchase zone. And there is, in much of this country, no requirement to disclose flood risk or flood history. So I think, these are things that are pretty low-hanging issues. They don't require big upheavals. You know who's opposed to that? All the people that make money off the transactions of selling homes. And homeowners who rightfully are scared to death that if they have to disclose flood risk, people won't buy the property and they'll have no value. But think about it. This largest single investment, there is no uniform requirement to disclose past flood events. And you may be buying a home that's been flooded more than once, and you have no right to know that in a lot of states. This isn't hard to do. The things to do are not hard. The willingness to do them seems to be impossible. But just think if we could start right now. And again, the two things that are costing us the most money and taking the most lives is heat and water. So the heat events is, I think, New York's, and what we've seen in our major metropolitan areas, is we've got to address it, and it's getting worse faster than many of our community coping mechanisms can do. But on water, it's about disclosing risk. It's about insuring risk. Two things we can do right now with imperfect programs to at least start building some financial resiliency and get rid of this narrow focus on only in the 1% flood zone and recognize that that is probably a much bigger risk that people need to understand. Your homeowner's policy does not cover rising waters. And that is the two things we could do right now to start building individual resiliency. Disclosure requirements nationwide for flood history and flood risk at the time before closing, and increasing the uptake of insurance. And it does not have to be the National Flood Insurance Program. Private insurers actually getting engaged here. And the more we can use the private sector to take that load off of the taxpayers, the better. And then my last thing is cut off the subsidy of providing subsidized flood insurance and disaster assistance in new construction. I think, quite honestly, we ought to go back and create bigger COBRA zones and put a lot of coastal development back in. You want to build it, finance it, and enjoy it with no subsidy from the federal taxpayer before, during, or after an event.
Sure. So I think that what Craig's saying about transparency of information is critical. And I think also just to pivot slightly, what we're seeing certainly on the climate mitigation side in the climate strike and the Sunrise Movement and the Green New Deal and the sort of the movement of the awareness of the younger generation is actually a piece that I particularly find personally very hopeful. I think it spills over into adaptation because folks are now demanding a response and holding people accountable, personally holding them accountable, and I think that that's really important. And I think that we spend a lot of time in the climate change world talking about risk mitigation, and what we really need to be talking about is how do we make this place livable in the future, and how do we continue to enact policies that both protect people from the effects of climate change at the same time as we mitigate the greenhouse gases that are causing it, right? So there is, I think, a really interesting public dialogue going on right now that is related to adaptation, and it's about holding people accountable.
I'd just like to throw in that one thing we've learned about personal resilience is it is highly dependent on community cohesiveness and that cultural resilience. That's the whole reason we're going through this process of moving the entire community of Ile-de-Jean-Charles, because those folks have relied on each other for generations and generations and continue to do so. And to have that cohesion dispersed across the whole state somehow would just destroy that resilience. And so I think that's a thing that we've got to think about as we think through how we adapt, is keeping people together and keeping those communities tight knit to the extent possible. It's extremely difficult, but it's possible.
Do you have anything to add, Alice?
Well, I just wanted to, as we're drawing to a close here, I'm reminded of what I heard from a climate expert who's been in this field for quite a while and gets frequently from the young people, who there seems to be so much more interest in this topic than certainly when I got involved a decade ago. And the only reason I was asked to get involved is because nobody else wanted to work on climate change. It was viewed as too politically toxic and something for 2100. It won't be relevant. So as we see this growth in the young people recognizing that this will affect their lives, and he was often asked his advice as to what they should do in the face of climate change. The fact that we're at a law school, I will just share with you that advice, which I have come to believe is wise advice. He said, be a lawyer. I think we're going to be talking about policy changes as we go forward. We're going to be talking about the litigation system and all of the legal skills that are that a school like NYU develops will be highly applicable as we work on very complex choices ahead as to how we make ourselves safer.
Okay. So we have only a few minutes left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask 2 or 3 questions, and I'm going to ask you to answer in one sentence or one word. So one, we don't want to overshadow the next panel on communications, but communicating the urgency of climate change and urgency of the need for adaptation is obviously important. So what one thing that you learned from your experience on the ground, having to communicate these people who are affected or being displaced or in the middle of some disaster. Second, many of the adaptation policies came as a response to some major event, whether it was Katrina or Superstorm Sandy. So how can we tell, what can we tell the cities who have not had an impact yet that they have to start moving and this is urgent and they're going to get affected? And finally, I want to hear one thing that keeps you optimistic as we talk about all the disasters and the impending doom, and what makes you going every day in and out as you deal with disasters and emergencies.
I remember the first question.
All right, I'll do this real quick. Number one voice that I think is emerged that is a local source that wasn't talking about this 5 years ago, but is talking about this more and more, are TV meteorologists. That is changing the narrative in many communities. What was the second question?
I had a question about optimism, and I wanted to...
I'm an emergency manager. We're not optimists.
And how do we raise awareness in cities that are not being hit yet?
Okay, yeah, I think TV meteorologists are kind of this new thing we're seeing in the last 5 years. That's becoming an increasing trusted voice talking about climate change. 2, what do we tell the other cities and communities that haven't been hit? It's like, you're up next. There's nowhere that's immune. And I think that's going to go back to when Moody's starts pricing bond risk. That's going to get attention. And I am a pessimist by trade. I'm a disaster guy. I'm an emergency manager. I say climate change. It's real. I don't have to use resiliency as my cover word. But I'm an optimist because I've seen us adapt to challenges that everybody thought was impossible, whether it's been disease, conflict. But it only works if we are in sync from local to federal. We don't have to like each other. We don't have to agree with each other. We just have to work together to solve common problems.
So I will sort of answer the first 2 questions at the same time. I think that we've got to engage more heavily with local community groups, neighborhood groups who know and can build that social cohesion that you were talking about earlier. Recovery from a disaster, we know that if you know your neighbor, you are more likely to be able to recover faster and weather that storm better. So I think that, there's often this disconnect about talking to the community, what are their needs, how can we address them from a government level. I think we have to break down some of those. And that can be cross-jurisdictional, across geographies, right? So, one community group that's been through a disaster speaking to another community group that hasn't can help build some of that knowledge sharing. So I think that, we need to be listeners and we need to help facilitate that social cohesion. I am an optimist. Sorry, I'm not an emergency manager, so I maintain my optimism. We have the solutions to these problems. We just need to move faster and we need to have stronger will. We can reduce greenhouse gases and we can protect people from the impacts of climate change that we know are coming. And so we have all those tools. We don't have enough of the structural pieces in place to make that a commonplace action, but it's coming. And I think that, again, going back to walking down Broadway during the climate strike last week, there's a lot of people asking for action, and they're going to be the next generation of voters. They aren't already voters, and so we need to look upon that with a lot of optimism.
My answer to the first two is we have to continue to come up with new and innovative ways to communicate with people. The data on our coastal risk were out there for people to see. Whenever nobody we talked to really understood it until we went and started talking with them one-on-one. And that's the answer to the second question too, is coming up with innovative ways that we may not recognize right now to communicate with folks who haven't been whacked. Because believe me, getting whacked is the first best way to realize. But after that, I don't know how you do it. My reason for optimism is that when we kicked off the Louisiana Watershed Initiative to try to change the way we address flood risk in the state, we went around the state last fall expecting a whole lot of negative response and pushback, and what we got a whole lot of was, it's about time, we're so excited that we're finally going to start doing this at the state level because we can't do it alone and we need this. And so that gave me a great deal of optimism about where people's heads are relative to the risk and how to address it.
I would say tell more stories. That's how we reach the hearts and minds. Meet people where they are in their own understanding of this. I think more tools to help us visualize would be very powerful. Also, I think the political activism is an important development. One of the barriers is not in my term, NIMT. We see that many politicians know what their risks are, understand what should be done, but the political calculus is it's probably not a good idea for them to do that right now. So we have to find ways for them to feel empowered. It's often you see it's a long-term mayor and late in his or her term or somebody else who knows they're leaving office that really becomes a leader on this issue. We need to change that so people early on can take on the issue, and that's voting them into office and supporting them through these difficult choices. And what gives me great optimism is the political activism. And as the mother of two daughters, I just read that 68% of the kids that are out there protesting right now are girls. Yeah, isn't that something? So I think they can help inspire more action and put pressure on all of us who are in decision-making positions to do better.
With that hopeful note, please join me in applauding.